I was walking down my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
I want to welcome you back to NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. My name's Dr. Timothy Christie.
And I'm Matthew Martin, and our co-host Neil Clements is off today.
So Matthew, today we want to remind people about our action items on NBWA. So we're really interested in there being some form of public inquiry into systemic racism in New Brunswick. We want Black history in a very robust way introduced into the education system in a very formal and robust way. And we also want to make racial discrimination a crime in Canada. Mm-hmm. So today I think we're going to focus mostly on the public inquiry aspect of what we're calling for. And there's been some really new developments in New Brunswick lately. Yeah,
so in March there was an announcement that a commissioner into systemic racism was going to be appointed. And finally here in September, a commissioner was announced. That individual's name is Dr. Manju Verma. So she'll be in charge of the commissioner position and really starting to look into systemic racism within New Brunswick.
That's right. And one of the things I think a lot of people are going to be interested in is what would a commissioner into systemic racism do? So there's going to be a lot of people that don't even believe systemic racism exists. And then in addition to that, they would say, a commissioner on systemic racism, what is this person supposed to do? But my understanding is that there was a press release with the announcement, and that gave us a few details of what the government expects her to do.
Yeah, so in that press release, they did discuss that the commissioner would be in charge of really three main aspects. The first aspects would be performing public consultations. Secondly, they'll be looking for qualitative and quantitative data. And the third final piece would be preparing a final report that'll be made publicly available with recommendations as well as an action plan for the province to address systemic racism.
Yeah, and the public consultations. So this is an interesting approach from my perspective. So they would obviously want to consult with, say, some Indigenous groups, probably some multicultural groups, probably Black Lives Matter groups like that. But for the life of me, what is this consultation process supposed to do? So we have groups who are obviously the victims of systemic racism, and they're going to tell us stories about systemic racism. They're going to tell us their experiences of systemic racism. And all of us have these. We all have stories and experiences that we could tell. But what practically is the commissioner supposed to do? So I know if you look at, say, some treaties with Indigenous groups, with Indigenous peoples, there would be a duty to consult. So before the government can do something that's on, say, unceded land and unceded territory, they would have to consult in a meaningful way with these groups. With racism, though, I don't see what public consultation is supposed to do. Obviously, they're not consulting with the racists. They're not going to be saying, okay, the police that are discriminating against people, the racist cops that are spot checking people, or the judges that are incarcerating Indigenous and Black people at higher rates, they're not consulting with them, I don't think. So what do you think is going to be happening from this weird public consultation process?
And I think you kind of hinted at it. When we look at the public consultation, nothing new is going to be said. Really, the only thing is now that, especially over the past year and a half, many individuals have been sharing their experiences of racism and systemic racism openly through many different platforms, be that Medium, YouTube, Facebook. They've been sharing their experiences. So having these public consultations is really just, having these individuals repeat something that's already been publicly made available, and then just to mark it down, and in my opinion, just a check mark on the list of kind of what needs to be done. My opinion is, yes, engaging with the public is important in this aspect, because it also helps provide opportunities for individuals to share their stories who may not have. But I think it's important as well as to ensure that it's a safe space, because even through my experience, a lot of folks have experienced systemic racism and experienced racism, but they don't openly talk about it because they don't want to rock the boat. And unfortunately, that's kind of the society our system is built, is if to openly talk about these things puts a lot of folks in these compromising positions, be that whether that's employment and they don't want to talk about their employer. So I think, the public consultations definitely need to be, had in a sense, but many of these stories have already been readily made available.
Yeah, so we have many public inquiries that had testimony from hundreds, if not thousands, of people from around the country explaining this. So if the government are saying we need public consultation to establish that systemic racism is present in New Brunswick, I would say they're wrong. We don't need a public consultation to do that. We know that it exists. All of us experiencing it know it exists. So in that sense, I think they're a little disingenuous. And without being too skeptical, governments frequently like to try to make as many people happy as they can. So to try to make as many people happy as they can, they'll say, let's have a broad public consultation. And I think it would be a huge disservice to all of New Brunswickers if Dr. Varma spends all of her time, or most of her time, or a lot of her time, doing public consultations, trying to hear stories from people. That shouldn't take long. If people want to write in letters and send essays and give biographies of some of the tragedies they've gone through with racism in their life, no problem. But the reason we want public consultation, I don't think the government's been clear. Why do we want that? Other than for political motives to try to placate all of the communities out there. And I don't think that's a good enough reason to say to this commissioner, we want you to spend time doing public consultations. On the other hand, maybe there's some other reason I'm missing, but I can't see for the life of me what is going to come from this except spending money and spending time on things that we already know. So our show is New Brunswickers Want Action. So our challenge to this new commissioner is we need you to do some things. We need you to do some concrete things. And focusing on process, and not outcome is probably not going to be acceptable from our perspective. So I think this public consultation thing is something that we'll probably talk about as we go on. And it's probably something that we should pay a lot of attention to, and also challenge our politicians. If this is really an important project, don't be playing political games with it, trying to satisfy a whole bunch of community out there. Get some real work done.
And I think even if we look at the fact of gathering quantitative and qualitative data, to spend a lot of time to do that, I can tell you based off of the work that Black Lives Matter New Brunswick has been doing, that information really doesn't exist. There's no race-based data to be collected here in New Brunswick. And I think we've kind of discussed it before, is really you in this situation you can almost start with an action first, and that action is to go and take a look and begin collecting race-based data in across the sectors in New Brunswick, because it's not collected in our health sector, it's not collected in our social development sectors, it's not collected in our education sectors. So even there you can't look at a magnitude of a problem, because we already know it exists. We already know systemic racism exists in New Brunswick. Our public consultations is just going to confirm that further. But the reality of it is you can't exactly see whether that's health outcomes, whether that's conviction rates, incarceration rates, stoppage rates of Black individuals. That information is just not openly tracked in many sectors, and that'd be a great starting point, is to say we need to have this done first.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. So quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data is obviously the hard numbers. What are these numbers? What is the rate of Blacks that are stopped in street checks? Or what is the rate of Indigenous people in the federal prison population or in the provincial prison population. These are hard. Quantitative means the hard numbers, and qualitative is a bit softer. So it would be more about stories, interactions. Here's my interaction with the police, and both of those are valid forms of data, qualitative and quantitative. So if we look at Department of Health here in New Brunswick, do they collect race-based data? So we know that Rodney Levi went to a hospital. He wasn't admitted to the hospital. He went to his preacher's house with a friend, and they asked at the preacher's house to call an ambulance, and we know the police showed up first because for good reason, and he was shot and killed before he could be transported to the hospital. So when he actually arrived at the hospital, it was as a dead person. So this is an example of an Indigenous person who was clearly sick, clearly so sick that it could be life-threatening because he ended up dead, but he couldn't get into the healthcare system. But we don't track that.
Exactly.
If you look at social development, we can hear rates of, say, Indigenous people that are in foster care, so Indigenous kids in foster care, it's astronomically higher than their percentage of the population. But do we have those numbers here in New Brunswick?
No.
Probably not, right?
Yep. And even that to say, so the only information that is available is within our some municipal police forces. So we know here in New Brunswick that for some municipal forces, the black population is about 1.6% of the population, but we know they make up 7% of calls that may look at suspicious activity or street checks. So if an officer is on duty and just decides, oh, this individual looks suspicious, I'm gonna stop them, or oh, this individual's on the street corner, what are they doing? I'm gonna go ask for some ID and stuff. Of those calls, we know black individuals make up 7% of those calls. So we know there that there's such a huge overrepresentation, and really the only thing that those individuals are doing is being black.
Right. So just to be clear for our viewers on this, so Black Lives Matter, several months ago, almost 6 months ago now, I think, got a huge contract from the provincial government to look at benchmarks for identifying systemic racism in New Brunswick.
That's correct.
You guys went through Department of Health, Department of Education, Department of Social Development. No one collects this information.
That's correct. Yep.
Very few police forces in the province collect this information, but you did get some from a few. So an example you've given is one police force says that in their community, 1.6% of the people in that community are black, but blacks constitute 7% of stops where the police officer uses his or her discretion and identifies this person as suspicious. So it's not that they're identified of committing a crime or accused of committing a crime. It's just the police officer says, I think this is a suspicious person. I'd better check their ID. I'd better pull them over. I'd better ask them a few questions where they're going. And that's where they represent 7% of those calls. So it's a overrepresentation of blacks, because if the distribution was normal, if blacks are 1.6% of the population, you think they'd make up 1.6% of those calls, but they make up 7% of those calls. So in this case, we have police officers who are racially profiling people.
And even to that point, they're openly doing so and then tracking into the system. Officers are not required, as well as if they just happen to be walking by and ask somebody about, if they're harassing an individual, they're not necessarily required to go and put that back into their system, and thus it's not reported. So again, we can't calculate for those numbers that aren't there.
So we know the minimum number is 7%.
We know
it could be much higher than that.
Absolutely.
But what we can prove quantitatively is that it's 7%. So our challenge to the commissioner is, now that you know this, what are you going to do about it? That's where we need the actions. We don't need you to spend a year consulting with black people to learn that they're overrepresented in police checks. So now you know this. You have the quantitative data. What are you going to do about it? That's the challenge. And nothing in the action plan or the job description from government tells us what this commissioner is going to do about it, except write a report that's going to inform a provincial strategy at some point.
Which, again, that has been done previously in our past through public inquiries, and recommendations are provided.
There's been numerous public inquiries in the past 50 years in Canada into these issues. And the most recent one for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls basically the first recommendation was implemented the recommendations from previous inquiries and reports.
Yep.
So it's kind of suspicious that one of the key activities of this commissioner position is going to be public consultation and looking for data that everybody knows doesn't exist. The premier is in charge of all these government departments. That premier could know very quickly if those departments collect this data. They don't.
Yep.
So he appoints a commissioner to collect data that he knows doesn't exist. That gives him a year of leeway, doesn't it? Because it's going to take this commissioner a year, which is taking you guys 6 months, to try to figure out that this is happening.
Yep.
Why didn't the premier, if he's serious about addressing this issue, say every department is going to collect the right data to help us figure out how to solve this issue? Then, all these months that they've been looking at this commissioner they're going to hire, they could have been collecting the data
Absolutely.
if they wanted to.
Yep.
And then that commissioner could sit down and have something to work with. But now they're behind the eight ball because the data doesn't exist. And we mentioned this on our show months ago, and the government still haven't done anything. So once again, it's easy to talk the talk, but when it comes to actual actions and doing things, I don't think that they're doing it.
Yeah. And again, to go so many years without collecting this data and originally to this point, it was previously tracked. In 2010, around 2010-13, they began to stop tracking this information out of fear that it was being used to discriminate. But again, we've always said that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And what the result it's getting now is, instead of a system where it could be tracked, it was able to be found whether Black individuals were facing longer wait times at hospitals or poorer health outcomes. That could be tracked based off of their intake survey at the hospital. But now, none of that information is readily available. They can only assume, for some communities, they can base it off of their address, and that's mostly for our Indigenous communities on reserves. But as far as for any other racialized group, it's just into a group. It doesn't exist. So this problem that has been very well aware of has really just polished itself more and more to what we have today, and eventually, in my opinion, needs to conform back to what it was of collecting this data, so we can acknowledge it.
Without cutting you off, I think what you're saying is they could have collected this if they wanted to.
Absolutely.
They know there's a problem. No one can pretend that racism doesn't exist. So these government heads, our ministers, our premier, they know there's a problem. And they're the ones that are in office, and they could collect the data if they want to. They could instruct their departments to collect it, and they don't. Why don't they do it? Maybe they'll claim ignorance. Oh, I didn't know I should. Well, if you look at anything, you see that Blacks are overrepresented by several 100% in police shootings. Indigenous people are overrepresented by several 100% in police shootings. If you look at the prison population, Indigenous and Black people are overrepresented in the federal prison population by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of percentage points. So there is no doubt that they're being shot and killed and arrested and stopped at rates disproportionate to white people. They know this, but they're not collecting the data so that we can say, here's a hard outcome to do it. But I think the more pressing question is, say you collect the data, what then? And this is where I think the next challenge we have to issue to this Commissioner of Systemic Racism is to actually do something. And I think the most important thing that the Commissioner can do is to actually make racial discrimination a crime that is punishable under the Criminal Code of Canada. And I know they're going to say the Criminal Code of Canada is federal legislation and they can't influence it, blah, blah, blah. I hear you. But right now in New Brunswick, you can go to jail for fishing or hunting without a license, but you can't go to jail for racial discrimination. We have the technology in New Brunswick right now that if someone goes to Crown land and steals a piece of wood, so they cut down a tree or something, the government in New Brunswick can do DNA testing of the wood in that person's backyard and identify it to the tree that they come from. We don't have that type of protection as Black and Indigenous people or immigrants in New Brunswick.
Yep.
So the government could do this. So let me just take a second to explain what I mean by making racial discrimination a crime in New Brunswick. Right now, across the country, we have human rights legislation. And the human rights legislation looks good on paper, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So first of all, the human rights legislation appoints a commission called the Human Rights Commission. But the Human Rights Commission don't advocate for individual rights. They act as an independent third party. So if I am the victim of racial discrimination and I want to make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission, the onus is on me as the victim to prove to them, to make a prima facie argument to them that racial discrimination has occurred. And then they will assess my claim. Now, as the victim of racial discrimination, I don't have the power to interview witnesses. I don't have the power to subpoena documents. I don't have the power to make people testify under oath. I don't have the power to arrest people, and I don't have the power to interview someone after they're arrested and detained. The police have that. If you steal a piece of wood from Crown land, or you go fishing or hunting without a license, the police will do that to you. But racial discrimination, they won't. So the trees don't have to prove that they were taken illegally. The fish and other wildlife don't have to prove it. But Black and Indigenous people in New Brunswick, the onus is on us to prove what's happened. Now, people will say to me, well, obviously you've got to prove it. There's no doubt about that. The proof is there, but I don't have access to it. So I know in my personal case, I tried to sue the University of New Brunswick for racial discrimination because I made an argument that they interviewed people that were less qualified than me. And that and the reason they didn't do this is because if they would have interviewed me, I would have had a hiring preference under their Equal Employment Opportunity Program, and they would have had to give me the hiring preference. They didn't want to do that, so they didn't interview me. The university said, no, we didn't interview him because he wasn't the most qualified applicant. So now, how do I prove? If I could subpoena the resumes of the people they interviewed, then we could put it down. We could just compare my resume to the people they interviewed and know it. The police have the power to do that. So the police could exercise a search warrant, go to the university and take those documents. And then we would answer the question one way or the other. And I'm not saying that the university discriminated against me. What I'm using is my personal experience as an illustration of how unfair the human rights approach is. The human rights approach says to me, if you can't prove it, then we can't pursue your claim. I'm saying, how can I prove it if I can't access their resumes? You can't do it that way. Every victim of racial discrimination in New Brunswick is at the same disadvantage. They don't have access to the information. So if there's an employer who says, amongst themselves, amongst the hiring committee, we're not going to hire this person for whatever reason, say because they're Black or they're Indigenous. And of course, they're not going to be that explicit about it. But if you could get all of the emails that show the chain of discussion amongst them, you might be able to prove that. That candidate who does not get the job is not going to be able to access that information. So one of the biggest problems with the human rights approach in New Brunswick is you can't access the information because the victim of racial discrimination doesn't have any of the powers of the state. Those powers of the state exist. Like I said, if you steal a tree, a piece of wood, or hunt or fish, the state will do this for you, for the tree or the fish, but they won't do it for Black and Indigenous people. Now, the approach of making it a criminal offense also means that if the person is convicted of it, they will get a criminal record, maybe even go to jail. So now, every police officer who racially profiles a person, that's illegal. Racial profiling should be illegal. It is illegal. If they are convicted of it, so the person who stopped says, look, that officer had no other reason to stop me other than I'm Black. That police officer should be investigated. They should be interviewed. And if all things being equal, it shows that that person was stopped because of a stereotype of being Black, that police officer can be maybe issued a fine, they could be suspended from work, they could be given 48 hours in jail or whatever, but they could develop a criminal record, which means you can't be a police officer, so we're taking the racist off. Or the doctor, or the nurse, or the teacher, or whomever. So one of the most structural things that this commissioner has to do is make it so that we can protect ourselves and that the state is at our service in protecting us the way it is at other things.
And I think you hit it on the point there, Tim. Those who are victims of racial discrimination can be given a tool to use, and the racists are then going to have a criminal record. They're going to be taken out of these positions of power, be that a police officer, a doctor, and it might not happen, in a year or 2 years. But very quickly, we'll start to see a society where racists are no longer in positions of power and able to put Indigenous and Black community members and racialized community members at a disadvantage, and we'll really start to see an equitable society here in New Brunswick. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Matthew. I think that what's important is that the individuals have the tools and the power to fight racial injustice. Right now, the approach the government's looking at is they're saying, let's tinker with our systems. Let's make it look like we're doing something to address systemic racism, but we're not going to empower the victims. Mm-hmm. And what we're saying is, no, first and foremost, you need to create a system where the victims are empowered to stand up for themselves and they have the resources of the state to do what they need to do. So I want to tell the Premier and his ministers, I'm not very impressed with their public consultation approach. I don't think that's going to be very useful. I understand politically why they want to placate communities, but there is important work that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that they've got a proper grasp of it. That being said, though, I do want this commissioner to be successful, and I hope that Dr. Varma takes our suggestions seriously, that we need to start by empowering victims, not these other process-oriented things where they are going to look at a framework and a provincial plan and that type of thing.
We want to thank you for tuning in to New Brunswickers Want Action. If you have any comments or questions or any topics you would like us to discuss on NBWA, feel free to give us an email at nbwa@chco.tv. My name's Matthew Martin, and remember, Black Lives Matter.